Chapter 9. Zinnias Bloom. Drink this. The old man set a glass in front of Mitsue and then sat down across the table. It will help the pain. The glass was filled with an amber liquid, and as Mitsue stared into its depths, he saw his own face reflected. I should have said before, the man continued. My name is Thaddeus Watery. Mitsue could tell they were back in the room he'd woken in some time before. The sheets of the bed strewn across the floor, the smell of sick in the air. Though in the light it all looked different. The darkness now revealed the largest bedroom Mitsue had ever seen, garbed in the pale yellow of fresh cream valances, cream curtains, a cream canopy on the bed, cream duvet, cream sheets, cream wallpaper, cream rugs and tapestries and seat cushions, even a cream chaise lounge. The table at which they sat was a creamy lightwood mounted on spindly golden legs. A number of gas lamps mounted along the walls lit the room, as did two slim golden chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. Watery screwed the cap onto the bottle from which he'd filled Mitsue's glass, the label of faded brown. I know your name as well. You're Mitsue Kageda, he said. Though I suppose I should say Kageda Mitsue, surname first in Tsukihaka. I always forget. Mitsue felt a mild jolt of surprise that this stranger should know his name, but he kept his head down and continued to stare into his glass. He examined his own vacant eyes disinterestedly. He tapped his finger on the table and set the reflection to twisting side to side. Whiskey, Watery explained. 37 years old? He said, a question in his voice. Then turning the label so that he could read it, he shook his head. 36. Plenty old. Old enough for regrets, as the saying goes. He laughed mildly. I certainly had enough at 36. He set the bottle on the table. Turner Hollands was never my favorite. More of a Douglas man myself. Still, it will help. It only burns going down. There's another saying for you. Certainly, you won't find anything else that hurts so little in life. He sighed and leaned forward in his seat. After a moment, he said, Speaking of which, I can heal your nose if you'd like. Mitsue made no reply. He continued to tap his finger against the table. The lights of the room were all soluble in the amber liquor, all focused and dissolved, all the world with it, rounded within a glass, tilting, shivering, jittering, molten illuminations bubbling up to the surface and sinking, chains of silver sheeting out like lightning on a breathless night. Watery allowed the silence to keep for a moment, then chipped it once more. I doubt you remember. After all, you were only a boy. He watched Mitsue over the rim of the bottle. We've met before, you and I, once at a party to celebrate Dr. Ashford's birthday. He withdrew from a pocket in the front of his uniform a silver flask and unscrewed the cap and took a long, thirsty drink and set it on the table and wiped his mouth. Of course, it was so many years ago. He played with the cap, raising it and lowering it back over the lip of the flask. Those were happier times. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat. You should drink. He gestured to Mitsue's glass. Really, it will help. The clicking of the kindler's communication devices could be heard faintly, as could screams from the wounded below. Every now and again a deep rumble would sound somewhere out in the city, and the shockwave would rattle the windows. An explosion nearby shook the manse, setting the chandeliers to swaying in close orbits, their lights staggering around the room. Watery watched this for a time. Then he said, The further I go back, the happier I seem to be. He spoke as if to himself, his lips barely moving. He took another sip from his flask. I was his preceptor once, at Ignis, Ashford. A rare talent, a rare man. Kind, as so few are. It was a shame. He dropped his eyes. A shame. What happened? He continued, He told me of you on the occasions we spoke together, how quickly you were growing, how gentle you were. He tilted his flask, examining it as if it were some silver beetle he had no knowledge of. In this world, it's those most gentle of spirit that suffer the most. How alike you are. As numb as he felt, the words still stung. Mitsue made a fist and pressed his nails into his palm, focusing on the pain, trying to lose himself in the sensation. Watery raised his flask. To Dr. Ashford, he said sadly. Mitsue watched the old man drink. In academy, I saw him work ignitions that'd be difficult for a postdoctorate. In that way, too, you are alike. Gifted. What you've done, the power you've displayed. Watery nodded at Mitsue, his hazel eyes hooded in melancholy. I doubt that's much consolation to you now, after everything. But it's true. He nodded. 16 years old, and you repelled Nocturo without any formal training. Only a handful of people in all the world could do what you've done, and maybe not even that many. Mitsue thought of the texture of Rei's skin, the look of her ruined teeth showing through the hole in her jaw. What I've done. The pressure was building in his head, behind his eyes, squirming to get out. We need people like you. The world needs people like you. People who can do what you've done. What I've done. Mitsue coughed, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. Closer now. He was getting closer. He could feel it pushing out at the seams, the pressure equalizing. Yes, what you've done. As horrible as it might seem now, we need... I killed her, Mitsue interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. There it was. The center of everything. He'd killed her. That it had been an accident, that he hadn't had control, none of it mattered. She was dead, and he was alive, and nothing he ever did could make that right. He understood that. The truth of it filled him completely. Yes, you did. Watery nodded his head slowly and then sighed. That was Rei Ashford, wasn't it? With minimal movement, Mitsue nodded his confirmation. Watery submerged himself into his flask once more, gasping for breath when he surfaced. When his breathing had settled, he looked into his hands and recited softly under his breath. All shadows fall across the stony court, and when again the light shall rise, few now who know. When again will zinnias bloom in meadows crushed neath ash, where yesterday the starlight fell, few now who know. There is a time and place, I hope, beyond the darkling sky, but of such dreams of no return, none now who know. He was silent, then he said, sitting straighter, You'll have to forgive me, I'm not much of a poet. He passed the silver flask back and forth between his hands, then unscrewed the cap and drank like a man dying of thirst, his throat bulging up and down. Yes, that's how it went, he said, taking a deep breath and considering the flask with a dim smile. It was part of a larger work, one that, and here he readjusted in his seat, that I wrote for my daughter's eulogy. He looked at Mitsue, and his eyes had neither light nor shadow in them, but were sodden like a gray day of rain. 42 years. Can it really be that long? He seemed to look at his curved reflection in the metal of the flask. They never tell you, when you're young, never tell you that you'll always feel the same. You'll never feel old, even as your body fails you. He released a quick breath of air and lay his flask on the table. Yesterday, he said gravely. It feels like only yesterday she lay on the pyre. Do you believe me when I say that? Time doesn't touch all wounds. Some stay fresh, forever open. He stood and faced away and was silent for a time. It was my fault, like you, but it wasn't quick. It wasn't over in an instant. It took years of negligence, He raised his hands to the height of his ears and then dropped them and faced Mitsue. What do the details matter? He sighed. What matters is that I had many opportunities to change. Too many. But I didn't. His lips made a flat line and he shook his head. I didn't. He turned and took 2 convulsive steps forward and then 2 steps back, as if choreographing the movements of an argument in his head. I thought of killing myself. Who wouldn't? Days when the cold glint of a knife was more precious to me than anything. It would have been so easy to die, as my wife chose. He said this softly, his voice barely a drizzle. So quick. The pain, a spurt of blood, then darkness, release. I wished for it. Every day I wished for it. I came close many times. Despair, that is the true darkness. Despair that eclipses even a glimmer of hope. Yes, that's where I dwelt, and sometimes I go there still. I am a thing of that darkness. He smiled somberly. I am that darkness. The old man had a haunted look, Mitsue thought. His eyes smoldered out of 2 deep pits. The flesh sagged from his bones. Maybe that was why Mitsue decided to speak. Why didn't you? He asked, his voice flaking out into the rarefied air, for he felt now the desire to go, to sleep, to join Rei on the other side of that wall. What reason could there be? Watery looked at Mitsue, his eyes red-rimmed and wet. Because I'm a coward, because I'm afraid to die, because... He panted as if lifting a great weight, pacing, his footsteps frenetic, his hands agitated. Then he sighed and came to a stop and said gently, But mostly it's because if I die, so does she. The memory of her. The smell of her hair, the way her face would crinkle up when she smiled. Her weight when she slept against my chest. He touched his breast, as if he could still feel her. There will be no one left to remember. A second death. Forgotten in the cold stretch of years. Forgotten as if she'd never been. As if all that time were a dream, lost upon waking. He stared absent-mindedly into his hand. As long as I live, she'll continue to live on. Some part of her at least. Less than a ghost. But something. That has to have some worth, doesn't it? At least, I have to believe that. He sat heavily in his chair, as if he could no longer bear the weight of his body on his legs. There is, he began haltingly, another reason. His face was a mask of anguish as he said these words, and he stared darkly into the bottle of whiskey before sipping from his flask,